Today, the U.S. faces one of the most alarming aliens ever. It's already here. If these alien species colonize the biggest freshwater system in America, they could cause devastation.
60 to 70% of everything alive in the water. Not 60% of the invasive fish. 60% of every living thing with fins, in some stretches of the Illinois River, by the year 2007. That number is not an exaggeration built for a headline. It is a measured biological reality that biologists spent 2 decades watching climb, helplessly, year after year, with no ceiling in sight. And then, without warning, without a new law, without a new dollar of emergency funding, that number began to fall. Nobody ordered it. Nobody budgeted for it. And for years, nobody could explain it either. To understand why that reversal unsettled the people who found it, you first have to understand what they had been living with. The Illinois Natural History Survey has been running boat surveys on the Illinois River since 1957, one of the longest unbroken freshwater monitoring records in the country. Decades of administrations came and went. Techniques changed. Boats changed. The river itself changed. But the ledger kept going, sample after sample, year after year. Then, in the 1990s, something entered that ledger that eventually swallowed every other trend inside it. Silver carp and bighead carp, 2 species native to the great river systems of China and eastern Russia, capable of growing past 4 feet long and tipping the scales at nearly 100 pounds. These fish did not arrive by accident of nature. They arrived because people brought them, deliberately, in the 1970s, as biological tools. Aquaculture operations and wastewater treatment facilities imported them for a very specific and, at the time, very sensible purpose: to filter algae and plankton out of ponds. They were extraordinarily good at that job. That was precisely the problem. Floods overwhelmed containment ponds. Equipment failed. In some documented cases, fish were released on purpose. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, these carp pushed steadily into the wider Mississippi River drainage and the Illinois River, connecting that basin directly to the Chicago waterway system and, through it, to Lake Michigan, became one of the most consequential invasion corridors in the country. Everything below that corridor was already compromised. Everything above it was the thing an entire regional coalition of scientists and agencies was scrambling to protect. The numbers coming out of the invaded reaches were almost impossible to process at a human scale. Electroshocking surveys, in which a boat-mounted current briefly stuns fish so crews can net and count them, were recording silver and bighead carp at rates of roughly 18 pounds per minute of sampling time in the hardest-hit stretches. Not per day, per minute. By 2007, biomass estimates in those worst sections had reached that staggering 60 to 70% figure, and the vocabulary biologists used to describe the fish began to shift. These were no longer described as invaders moving through an ecosystem. They had become the ecosystem, the organizing fact that every other species in the water now had to build its life around. So when survey data from 2017 and 2018 started showing something different, the reaction inside the research community was not celebration. It was suspicion, and rightly so. Dr. James Lamer, a fisheries biologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey, had spent years reading trendlines that only ever moved one direction. That is simply what monitoring an unstoppable invasion looks like from the inside: a slow, grinding confirmation of bad news, survey after survey. So when the 2018 numbers landed on his desk showing a statistically significant decline in catch per unit effort for both bighead and silver carp, across 3 separately monitored reaches of the lower Illinois River, his first assumption was not that the invasion had turned a corner. It was that something in the analysis was wrong. That instinct is not pessimism, it is professional discipline. A trend line that moves one direction for 20 straight years and then reverses is, statistically speaking, far more likely to reflect a sampling error, a shifted survey site, or an unusual water year than an actual turn in the biology. So he reran it. The decline held. Nobody was declaring victory, because the numbers on their own explained nothing. Commercial harvest crews had been pulling tens of thousands of pounds of carp out of the Illinois River every year, and that effort was real and difficult and important. but it had not scaled up in those specific stretches in any way that could account for a multi-season, statistically robust drop in juvenile recruitment. The removal curve and the decline curve simply did not match. The regional coordinating body overseeing Asian carp response acknowledged the softening in its 2019 annual report and then, in effect, went quiet, because there was nothing further it could responsibly say. The harvest data didn't explain the drop. The physical barriers didn't explain the drop. Something was reducing the survival of juvenile carp in those corridors at a rate no active management program in the region had ever achieved on purpose, and nobody could name what that something was. The first real piece of the answer came from a laboratory that was not studying Asian carp at all. In 2019, researchers associated with Southern Illinois University Carbondale published findings from a multi-year gut content study, the deliberately unglamorous process of opening recovered fish and cataloging exactly what they had been eating, conducted on alligator gar collected across sections of the Mississippi and Illinois river systems. Alligator gar is the largest freshwater fish native to North America, an animal that regularly exceeds 6 feet in length and can weigh past 300 pounds, with a lineage stretching back more than 100 million years in the fossil record. It was swimming in these rivers before the extinction of the dinosaurs, and it kept swimming long after. What very nearly finished the species off was not a natural predator. It was us. Through the first half of the 20th century, state wildlife agencies across the region classified alligator gar as a trash fish, on the reasoning that it competed with prized sport species like bass, crappie, and catfish for food. That belief hardened into deliberate policy, and policy came with equipment. Agencies ran targeted electrofishing operations specifically to bring gar to the surface for removal, netted them out of spawning aggregations at the precise moment the species was most vulnerable, and in some regions ran poisoning campaigns in backwater habitat where gar concentrated. None of it was considered controversial at the time, because almost nobody in a position of authority saw the loss of the species as a loss at all. Combine that deliberate eradication effort with decades of dam construction that severed the floodplain habitat gar require for spawning, and by the 1970s the species had effectively vanished from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and much of the upper Mississippi drainage. An animal old enough to have outlived the asteroid could not outlive 20th-century American fisheries policy. Dr. Solomon David, a gar biologist affiliated with Southern Illinois University Carbondale, had spent years arguing that this eradication ranked among the great unexamined mistakes in American fisheries management, that alligator gar functioned as a native regulator, and that removing it left an ecological gap nothing else in these rivers was built to fill. The 2019 gut content research gave that argument concrete evidence for the first time. Asian carp turned up repeatedly in the stomachs of recovered gar, across multiple individual fish and multiple collection sites, not as an occasional item that happened to be nearby, but as a consistent, recurring part of the animal's diet. Here is why that detail matters so much. A fully grown adult Asian carp moving through open water is extraordinarily difficult prey. Fast, powerful, and largely unreachable by whatever native predators still remain in these rivers. That is part of why the original invasion ran essentially unchecked for so long. But juvenile carp in their first year of life are an entirely different proposition. They are small, slow, and they concentrate in shallow, vegetated, low-current backwater habitat. Precisely the kind of water alligator gar evolved over tens of millions of years to hunt in. Picture a warm, still Illinois backwater in late spring, its water clouded and shallow, threaded with drowned timber, every surface offering cover. Somewhere in that cover, a gar many feet long holds itself perfectly motionless, not resting, but working, in the way ambush predators with slow metabolisms are built to work, spending almost nothing until the exact instant it strikes. Into that same water, over the following weeks, arrives a season's worth of juvenile carp. Small, slow, energy-dense, and concentrated in exactly the shallow habitat the gar is already occupying. The gar does not need to chase anything. It waits, it feeds, and it waits again, repeating that cycle across an entire spawning season without ever paying the metabolic cost that active pursuit would demand. Multiply that single scene across a slowly recovering gar population spread through a connected network of backwaters, season after season, and you are no longer talking about isolated predation events. You are describing a sustained continuous reduction in juvenile survival at exactly the life stage that determines whether a population grows, holds steady, or contracts. Asian carp reach reproductive maturity in roughly 2 to 3 years. If enough juveniles fail to survive their first year across enough consecutive spawning seasons, the adult population eventually stops replacing itself. Commercial harvest, valuable as it is, works differently. It removes adult fish that have already grown, already fed, already spawned, and already reshaped the ecosystem around them. It is cleanup after the fact. Predation on juveniles interrupts the process before it ever delivers results, which is why recruitment, not adult abundance, is the only stage where lasting, structural change to a population is actually possible. That raised an obvious question. If a functionally extinct native predator was the mechanism behind the shift, where did enough of them come from, and who put them back? The answer traces to 2004, when the Illinois Department of Natural Resources launched a native species restoration initiative for alligator gar that had nothing to do with Asian carp at all. It was framed entirely around biodiversity and ecological heritage, an attempt to restore an animal that had lived in these waters for millions of years before an earlier generation of managers erased it based on assumptions nobody had actually tested. Nobody involved in that planning process was thinking about invasive species control. Success was measured in fingerling survival and population establishment, full stop. Missouri launched a comparable restoration effort in 2008. Arkansas expanded its own gar management framework around the same period, and Tennessee began targeted stocking shortly after. Every one of these programs ran independently, under different agencies, different mandates, and different definitions of success, with essentially no coordination with anyone working on Asian carp suppression, because there was no reason for that coordination to exist in the first place. That institutional separation is the specific reason this effect was able to build quietly for close to 15 years before anyone connected the two datasets. Alligator gar mature slowly. Hatchery juveniles stocked in 2004 and 2008 needed roughly 7 to 10 years just to reach a body size capable of consistently taking carp-sized prey, which meant the predation pressure those fish would eventually generate did not begin showing up in monitoring data until somewhere around 2014 through 2016, precisely the window when the Illinois Natural History Survey's long-running trend lines began behaving in a way they never had before. In 2022, researchers with the USGS Columbia Environmental Research Center cross-referenced historical gar stocking records against carp monitoring data across overlapping river sections, and the relationship between years elapsed since stocking and measurable carp decline held up consistently enough across independent datasets to demand a formal explanation. A biodiversity restoration program had, in effect, been running a functioning carp suppression operation for 15 years. Nobody had authorized it as such. Nobody had budgeted for it. And almost nobody had noticed. One serious and entirely fair objection remained standing. Perhaps the carp had not declined at all. Perhaps they had simply relocated into unmonitored stretches of river, which would make every piece of this story look identical to a real decline while meaning essentially nothing. That is the difference between a genuine discovery and a statistical mirage, and it deserved a real answer, not a convenient one. That answer came from environmental DNA. Beginning around 2023, researchers working under a USGS-affiliated EDNA monitoring program compared water column genetic material collected at fixed Illinois River sampling stations against archived samples going back more than a decade. Environmental DNA is genetic material that organisms constantly shed into the water through mucus, waste, and skin cells, and its major advantage over netting is that it does not depend on catching anything at all. It measures what is genuinely present in the water, independent of gear efficiency, boat placement, or fish behavior. Between 2015 and 2022, silver carp DNA concentrations declined significantly across multiple lower Illinois River sampling zones, most sharply in the backwater-connected stretches where alligator gar restoration had been most active, while upstream zones still returned strong carp signals. At the same time, genetic signatures from large native predatory fish, including alligator gar, increased in those same corridors. Fewer carp were shedding DNA into that water. Not harder to catch. Fewer. By 2024, an additional layer of recovery had become visible, one that surprised even researchers who had been tracking the predation story closely. Submerged aquatic vegetation, the underwater plant beds that stabilize sediment and shelter native fish and invertebrates, had been collapsing across the Illinois River since the early 2000s, a casualty of the way silver and bighead carp feed. By stripping plankton directly from the water column and stirring bottom sediment as they do it, these fish had been driving turbidity so high that sunlight could barely reach the riverbed, and the vegetation that depended on that light simply died back. Long-term monitoring jointly run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Geological Survey recorded measurable, statistically significant increases in submerged vegetation density between 2019 and 2023 in specific backwater complexes downstream of Havana, Illinois, the very same corridors where carp recruitment had weakened and gar presence had risen. Water clarity improved alongside it. And in 2023, survey data showed modest but real increases in young bluegill and largemouth bass in those same recovering backwaters, native species whose survival depends directly on the vegetated habitat carp had suppressed for 2 decades. Researchers, including Dr. Michael Duisberg with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, described the sequence as consistent with the kind of trophic cascade documented in other freshwater systems after invasive suppression, vegetation recovering first, native fish recruitment following behind it. None of this is being treated as an unqualified victory, and the caution is appropriate. The declines are corridor-specific, not system-wide, and upstream stretches of these same rivers still carry heavy carp loads. Flow variation, water temperature, and food availability all influence carp recruitment on their own, and separating those natural factors from predation pressure remains active, ongoing research. What can be said honestly is that in the specific corridors where large native predators have re-established, carp recruitment is measurably lower, and it has stayed lower across multiple years and multiple independent lines of evidence. Field surveys, gut content analysis, stocking records, and molecular genetics all converging on the same conclusion through entirely different methods. The open question left standing is not really scientific at all. It is a question of timing. Alligator gar stock today will not be hunting effectively until sometime in the 2030s, because the species simply cannot be rushed toward maturity. Some individuals have been documented living beyond 95 years, and males typically do not reach sexual maturity until around age 6, with females taking roughly 11. Meanwhile, the proposed federal infrastructure meant to permanently separate the carp-infested Illinois waterway from Lake Michigan, the Brandon Road Project, carries a projected cost near $858 million and has been moving through planning and partial authorization since 2017, with full construction funding still not finalized. 3 separate clocks are running here, a biological one measured in decades, an institutional one measured in budget cycles and congressional votes, and the carp's own clock, measured simply in spawning seasons. Only one of those 3 is fast, and it does not belong to the people trying to solve this. Perhaps the most striking part of this entire story is the irony sitting quietly underneath it. The very animal now helping reverse one of the most severe ecological invasions in American freshwater history is the same animal an earlier generation of American agencies spent decades deliberately trying to wipe out, netted from its spawning grounds, poisoned in its backwaters, electrofished on site, and officially classified as worthless. They were confident that removing it would improve their rivers. They were wrong in a way that took nearly a century to become visible, because the gap that removal left behind was invisible in 1950, invisible in 1970, and still invisible in 1990. It only became legible decades later, when a new invader arrived that the missing predator would have been perfectly built to control, and there was nothing left in the water to control it. Then, in 2004, a handful of managers who were not thinking about carp at all put that animal back into its own river, simply because it belonged there. That quiet, uncoordinated decision has turned into one of the most effective invasive species interventions in the history of the Mississippi Basin, and it will be nearly 30 years before anyone can measure its full effect. Nobody planned it that way. Nobody ran the projections that would have revealed what was building beneath the surface of those backwaters. The river worked it out on its own, long before the people studying it caught up, and it leaves behind a question worth sitting with. What else did we once decide was worthless, only to discover, far too late, that we needed it all along?